Isabel Menzies Lyth, renewing my conversation with Amy. Just at the very end of the war was virtually over when I joined a bit of the army called War Office, wait a minute now, Civil Resettlement. And that was for British prisoners of war coming back, first from Germany and then from the Far East. And I was in that for rather over a year before I moved to Tavistock, and everybody was there, you know, Eric Triss, Tommy Wilson, Tom Main, all the main, and Jock Sutherland, all the main people were in that group in the army. Bion was obviously in it too. I didn't actually meet him then, but he was there. So that group was loosely in existence then, and group work was going on. Of course, obviously you know about the Bion work at Northfield and all that. And one war job I had was actually in London in the War Office, and Eric heard I was there through somehow mutual friends or something, and so he got me moved from where I was in the War Office into War Office selection boards, which was one of the big tabby group things. And so I worked for 2 months with Eric then, and then when I needed a job, I wrote and said, hi, you know, have you got a job? And that's just when I went into the army. And picked up my connections with Eric again. So I owe him an enormous lot. I mean, he was a very, very respectful man. He had great respect for his juniors. He was quick at picking up people's gifts and nurturing them. I'm only one of a number of people who could say the same about Eric. Very generous, very helpful. We had 20 different units in civil resettlement scattered over the country, and headquarters was in the south near London, where I was. And so we had 20 units, so all the men were placed in the unit nearest to their own homes. And they were helped to settle back in their families and helped to find work and get orientated in general. We had a huge conference about 1947 maybe in England, when a lot of the people came across from America, the people from Michigan. I can't remember the names offhand, but I would remember if you told me. And it was interesting because the differences began to appear very clearly. Almost at that exact time, it became the Clinic and Institute, and that was, at that time, sort of Siamese twins. It was all one body, and it was later that they separated into two distinct bodies. So Clinic and Institute, when I joined it, a lot of us worked in both. The major difference between the American group and ours in England was, of course, our basis in psychoanalysis. That was a huge difference, and I can remember that conference quite clearly, and being quite surprised sometimes at the things the Americans said, because they hadn't got our psychoanalytic depth. I mean, I was an absolute babe in psychoanalysis at the time, but nevertheless, it permeated our thinking. It's quite extraordinary how the unconscious wasn't taken into account, and went for 3 weeks to the NTL conference. So, you know, it was all very new and much more, and I use this word in quotes, much more scientific. You know, there was a lot of research, open research going on, and that, again, struck me as being extremely odd. Because they didn't take any account of the effect the research was having on the members of the conference, that were on their behaviour, and it was really already quite strange to me. My first experience, and I was at the first Leicester, was something vastly different. We were rather pleased, shall we say, with what we'd done in the army. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to stay together was to continue to do the same kind of work in a similar sort of way, not to develop it, but you know, basically to help the community at large. You see, and a lot of the things we did to begin with were straight. You see, Harold Bridger his work in Unilever was a straight derivative from war office selection boards in the army. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it was that, but at the same time, we were very, very sure that psychoanalysis had an important contribution to make. And I think, to be true to say, everybody at first was in analysis, or is not already qualified as an analyst. And then it gradually, quite a lot of us were in analytic training, people like Harold Bridger and John Hill and me. Were actually, Eric Triss never trained as an analyst, Tommy Wilson did, and Tom Main did. So a huge number of the original group actually did the full analytic training. Mm-hmm. Some of them didn't ever practice, but a lot of us combined the two kinds of work. Bion's work was going on, and I had 2 years as a student member of a group with Bion.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, absolutely. I can't remember anything about it, I can tell you. It's very strange. I can remember being terribly awestruck by Bion, who was a large man in every sense of the word and sat there looking like Buddha, I can tell you. Ken Rice said once of Bion that he was a man who could sit further behind his face than anybody else he knew. You probably find that written down somewhere. And it was true. And it was terribly impressive, and we were very scared. He was a leader. He was a magnificent leader. You know, he got huge decorations for being a leader in the trenches in the First World War, you know, with his tanks. It was more that he felt the need to be more intensively occupied in psychoanalysis than that he sort of, as it were, abandoned group work because he wasn't interested. I think it was more for his own personal development. And I think that was partly why he went to America as well. And I think he was right in thinking that if he stayed here, there would be too many demands on him to be a leader, say in British Psychoanalytic Society, and probably in the Tavistock, because people did depend on him. He was like a rock. He was aware that he had a tremendous feel for the psychotic, and, you know, working with that, and he wanted to experience it more intensively in order to develop his theories. You can see a trend in Bion's work about the underlying psychotic in the normal, person, which is what you get in group work, if you can see it. That's to say, not everybody does. I had my second analysis with Bion. My own one, the one I had for me, you know, was against the one I had to have for training. Oh, his style was different. His whole orientation was different.
Wow.
But again, I often hear how much Americans can tell you about what happened in their analysis. I can't really tell you anything that happened in mine, except it was a very deep, rich experience. You know, I'm sure I changed an awful lot. He and Ken Rice were terribly, terribly close friends, but a very meaningful friendship for both of them. So you can take it for granted that Ken Rice was very, very much influenced by Bion. And, you know, they would spend long hours talking about things together. I always worked very well with Ken. You know, he listened, took account of you, respected you, but he was also decisive. You know, because people like us can go on talking forever and ever and ever and ever without reaching a decision while we work it all through and through and through. And Ken would, you know, he would, I can remember at the staff meetings sometimes we go on for 3 hours without coming to a decision, and Ken would say, I've listened to you very carefully and this is what we're going to do. You know, and we knew we'd been listened to carefully, and so we accepted it. He was a good manager. Harold and Ken had very different gifts, and Ken had a much greater gift for good management, whereas Harold, I think, was very gifted, insightful in the work, but not perhaps as good not as, perhaps quite as well organised a manager, shall we say. And I think, you know, quite a lot of the staff felt they preferred to be more structurally managed, as it were. And I think Bion's group work was very, his writings on groups, very influential in the original group relations group. In the original one, we had, I think, really something like what they now call a work discussion group, where people who were in the same sort of role at home met together to talk about their work within the, within the aura of the Leicester Conference. But it wasn't a self-examining group. It was about the there and then, and going home to see how you could use what you learned at Leicester. It was much simpler. There was a lecture series also at the early on, before we decided that intellectual learning wasn't what we were about really. So gradually that, and the work discussion groups gradually faded, and it was more and more intensively studying the here and now wherever you were. I was the woman, I was the only one for quite a while, apart from secretaries. And we had people we called research assistants for a time. I was the only professional woman for quite a long time. It was okay, no problem. Yeah. I find it hard to understand all this stuff about women not being treated fairly, because the men at the Tavistock were very respectful and fair, and and it wasn't sort of noticeable. Because for me, part of the task of being a staff member at a Leicester is to work with these complications, not to avoid them, but to confront them and work with them and analyse what they mean and how they affect people. So I don't sort of, I find that slightly childish, I think.
Yeah, I think that's...
I think it's more American than British as well. But if something happens out there, say in the large group, which disturbs my members of my small group, and it's in their minds when they come into the group, it's in. So my view of the here and now is simply, if it's in my group members' minds this morning, it's here. It's still alive, they're worried about it, it's affecting their behaviour in my small group. What I'm trying to do is to understand what's going on, why what's happening is happening, and to help them understand, and therefore, as a result of understanding, to move forward. So if a group is stuck, I need to know, I'm asking me. I'm not asking them, I'm asking me. I'm sitting there thinking, what's this about? I think people are more capable of being honest with themselves. Some are more capable of being honest with themselves than others. And you have to be honest, because you've got to sort out whether it's you being neurotic or whether it's a group, really the group that's doing it. I think Turkey and Bion and Trist, and I think Harold Bridger and me, probably others, I see Tim Dartington, you never mentioned, had that feeling that we understood about how a person in a group could apparently lose his real self altogether and change in the most incredible way because of other members. And I personally rather try to specialise in the subtleties of how that's done, because it can sound like magic, and it isn't. We've all got mad bits. And I think a lot of it was linked up with Bion's understanding of projective identification in groups and the development, the understanding of attribution of roles to people in groups. I remember Eric Trist coming out of a meeting one day and saying, I am twice my normal size, by which he meant I'm so full of other people's projections that this is not me anymore. So it's probably early 50s again. Trouble is, so many people are dead now. It's very sad. But Eric Trist was certainly there, and Tommy Wilson, and Bion, and me. And Harold Bridger would have been certainly there. Jock Sutherland would have been there. And then I think Cartwright and French and the other guy. It was a very tense conference, I can tell you. I think we were a little shocked by their naivety in psychoanalytic terms, and I think sometimes we made it rather plain that we felt shocked. And I can remember one of the Americans saying, well, let's take a simple example. Let's take milk. And we all went, what? You know,
Yeah,
milk?
simple, yeah.
I don't think that's a correct example, but that's the flavour of it. We couldn't see how anybody could possibly think milk was simple, you know. And so I think the differences began to appear, and we began to feel that we had perhaps got more better bedfellows elsewhere. And then through Margaret Rheoch, we met people like Larry Gould. But Margaret came with, you know, with these various bright young men when she came to the first Leicester. And we were hopeful that they were a group in America that we could work with. And I think, you know, we did feel about them. And the kind of research they were doing at NTL was like that. It was pathetic. Somehow, you know, if group relations can help to develop different ways of looking at management and authority, then that'd be good. I think what is terribly difficult is to really see what's going on your own organisation, though, you know, it's like you can't analyse yourself really. And I think some of the big organisations which run group relations training are really in quite a mess themselves, because they can't get the distance to really understand what's going on in themselves. I think it's very important to have somebody from outside. And it's very hard for groups like that to admit they need somebody from outside.